The cross. It's the central symbol of Christianity, right? Has been for 2,000 years. But here's the thing. What did Christ's death actually accomplish? It's a question that has, believe it or not, divided believers for centuries. And today, we're going to dive deep into the history of that great divide.
All right, so here's our roadmap. We're going to start with the words themselves because you'll see language really shapes what we believe. Then we're going to jump in a time machine, go back to the early church, and see how they understood the cross. Spoiler alert, it was a rescue mission. Then we'll pinpoint the exact moment that story changed and how it led to this huge theological split. And finally, we'll see how this whole history leaves us with two, honestly, very different pictures of God.
Okay, first things first. Before we get into all the big theories, we've got to start with something kind of basic, the language. Why? Well, because a word we all think we know, atonement, meant something completely different to the first Christians than it does to a lot of us today. So just take a second and think about it. When I say the word atonement, what's the first image or idea that pops into your head? For a lot of people, it's something about a payment, right? Or maybe appeasing an angry God. And yeah, if you look it up in a modern dictionary, that's pretty much what you'll find. It's about making a payment, a reparation for a wrong. But check out that date. This definition really only locked in around the 1600s. I mean, that's over 1,500 years after the cross. That's a huge time gap. And that right there leads us to the million-dollar question. If our modern idea is all about payment, is that what the original biblical authors actually meant? Did they see it that way? Well, the short answer is not really. The original Hebrew word, kafar, has a totally different vibe. It's not about paying back a debt. It's about covering, cleansing, reconciling. So think of it less like a transaction in a courtroom and way more like mending a deeply broken relationship. And this idea of mending and restoring, that was absolutely central for the early church. I mean, for the first 1,000 years of Christianity, their whole view of the cross was built around one powerful theme: rescue. Now, they pictured this rescue in a few different ways. Some saw it as a ransom to liberate humanity from evil and death. Others saw Christ as a kind of new Adam, fixing the broken human story. Or they saw him as healing the image of God in us. But you see the common thread, right? No matter how they framed it, the goal was always the same: freedom and restoration. And this is so crucial to get. For the entire early church, God isn't some offended king who needs to be paid off. He's the rescuer. The cross wasn't about changing God's mind about us. It was about changing us, healing us, freeing us. But then things changed. Around the 11th century, a massive shift happened. A brand new way of thinking, really shaped by the culture of the day, created what we're calling the Great Divide. The whole focus started to move away from rescue and zeroed in on repayment. You can see the turning point right here on this timeline. There's this one theologian, Anselm of Canterbury. Now, he's living in a medieval feudal society, with lords and vassals and codes of honor. And he comes up with this totally new model. For him, sin wasn't a disease that needed healing. It was an insult, a debt of honor owed to a cosmic lord. Listen to his own words. He basically argued that God's honor had been offended by human sin. And just like a feudal king, God couldn't just let it go. The debt had to be paid. To just forgive without any punishment or payment was seen as improper, not something a just ruler would do. And this right here, this is the heart of the shift. Do you see it? The whole point of the cross was no longer about healing us. It was now about satisfying something in God, his wounded honor. All of a sudden, the big problem wasn't our brokenness, it was God's need for justice to be satisfied. So Anselm planted this seed, this idea of repayment. And over the next 500 years, it just grew and morphed, and it really came into its own during the Protestant Reformation. What happened was the reformers took Anselm's basic idea of satisfying God, but they changed the currency. It wasn't about satisfying God's honor anymore. Now it was about satisfying God's wrath. This theory is what's known as penal substitutionary atonement, or PSA for short. And it basically sees the cross as a legal event where Jesus takes the full force of God's punishment that we deserved. And this new picture of a God who had to pour out violent punishment on his own son became unbelievably influential. I mean, for millions and millions of Christians, this became the default setting. It was often the only story they ever heard about what happened on the cross.
Okay, so now we've got these two competing frameworks in our heads, right? Rescue versus repayment. So what happens if we take a really key biblical passage, like the famous one in Isaiah 53, and look at it through both of those lenses?
All right, so Isaiah 53, it's a huge passage for the repayment view. When you read it through that lens, the suffering servant isn't just suffering in a general way. He's being actively and directly punished by God.
But here's where it gets really fascinating. The passage itself actually calls out that idea. It says, "We assumed that God was the one striking him down." It's like the text is acknowledging the human perspective, what it looked like was happening from the outside. But then, in the very next sentence, the text pulls a switcheroo. It clarifies that he was pierced for our offenses, that the whole point was our welfare, and that by his wounds, we are healed. See that? The focus snaps right back to humanity's restoration, which is the very heart of the early church's rescue model.
So look, this isn't just some dusty, abstract theological debate. This whole 1,000-year journey through an idea, it really matters. Because what we're left with are two profoundly different pictures of who God is and what justice even means.
It really all boils down to this, doesn't it? Is God's justice restorative, or is it retributive? Is the whole point to heal and restore where forgiveness is just offered freely? Or is the point to collect on a debt where forgiveness is actually impossible without some kind of violent payment first?
One of those views seems to fit really well with passages like this one from Isaiah. It talks about a God who doesn't need a payment before he can forgive. No, he has compassion and he pardons abundantly. All you have to do is turn back to him.
And that really leaves us with the final question at the heart of this great divide. When you look at the cross, what do you see? Do you see the work of a cosmic creditor who has to collect a debt even if it means collecting it from his own son? Or do you see the work of a divine physician entering into our sickness in order to bring about our cure? It's a question that has shaped and continues to shape the faith of millions.